The open-pollinated field corns of the plain farms of Lancaster County were never the corns that the seed company catalogs of the 1960s photographed in their glossy color plates. Never the corns that arrived sealed in printed paper sacks from the hybrid breeding stations of the Midwest. Never the corns whose names were trademarks, whose pedigrees were closed, whose seed could not be saved because the second generation would not come true. They were, instead, the corns that a farmer made himself, selected ear by ear, autumn after autumn, from his own field, by his own eye, against his own ground. The way corn had been made on this continent for the 3 centuries before a laboratory ever entered the question. They were the corns of the first German settlers who had come up the Conestoga in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the Indian corns those settlers had learned from before them, the gourd seeds and the flints and the broad-kerneled dents that each valley and each family had bent, slowly, across generations, toward its own soil and its own weather and its own particular needs, until a corn was less a product than a kind of memory. 100 years of one family's answers to one piece of earth, written in the only language a corn can keep, which is its seed. To understand the keeping of such a corn, one has first to understand the people who kept it. The plain farms of Lancaster County were the work of the Amish and the Mennonite families who had come out of the Palatinate and the cantons of Switzerland in the 1700s, fleeing the wars and the persecutions of the old country, drawn across the ocean by William Penn's promise, that here a man might farm his ground and worship as his conscience bound him and be left. In the main, alone, they had come up the Conestoga and spread out across the limestone valleys, and they had found in that deep, sweet soil the finest farm ground on the whole eastern seaboard, and they had bent themselves to it with a patience the worldly around them never quite understood, building the great bank barns first and the houses second, keeping the woodlots and the fence rows, rotating the fields and spreading the manure, and folding the clover back under, so that the ground they farmed grew richer under their hands across the generations instead of poorer, which is the rarest thing in all of agriculture, and the truest measure of a people's care. They did not farm for the year. They farmed for the grandchildren, and a corn that a man selected by hand, slowly, across the decades, toward his own particular ground, a corn that got a little better suited to that one farm with every autumn that passed, was simply farming for the grandchildren made into a living thing, a seed-shaped patience, handed down the way the ground itself was handed down and the faith was handed down, from the dead to the living to the not yet born. There were many such corns once up and down those valleys, each one a little different, each one belonging to its own family and its own fields. The Stoltzfus corn was one of them. It had its reputation in the quiet way such things had reputations among people who did not boast. It was known to dry clean in a wet fall, known to stand in a blow, known to make good meal and good fodder both, and a neighbor in a hard spring might come and ask Amos for a little of it to start over with, and Amos would give it, because that was the way, and ask for nothing back, but that the man save his own from it after, and pass the favor on some day. That was how a corn lived, not locked in a vault, not sold in a sack, but kept moving slowly, hand to hand and field to field and generation to generation, getting wiser as it went. On the farm at Cherry Hill, in the Old Order district that the bishops numbered District 6, that older way of making corn had a keeper. Her name was Saloma Stoltzfus. In the autumn of 1968, she was 61 years old, and she had been a widow for 2 of those years since the morning in the spring of 1966 when her husband Amos had been found at rest in the milking parlor with his hand still on the stanchion, gone in an instant at 59, leaving her the house, the 83 acres, the dairy of brown Swiss, and the thing he had cared for more particularly than any animal on the place, the corn. It was not a famous corn. It had no name a catalog would recognize. Amos had called it simply the home corn, and his father Christian had called it that before him, and Christian's father before that, and it had been grown on Stoltzfus ground in an unbroken line since before the Civil War, a tall, late, deep-rooted, broad-leaved field corn of no single uniform type, because uniformity had never been its purpose. Every autumn Amos had walked the field before the picking and chosen his seed by hand. Not the biggest ears, not the showiest. He chose from 100 different plants across the whole field, the ones that stood after a wind, the ones that stayed green in a dry August, the ones whose ears hung down and dried clean and turned away the mold, the ones whose roots had held in the wet corner where the spring seeped, the ones that had ripened a week early in the cold year and a week late in the hot one, and he saved their seed in glass jars in a pine chest in the cellar, each jar labeled in his careful German hand with the year and the row and the reason. 100 mothers, he used to say, so that no single trouble could take them all. What that hand selection had made across 100 years and more was not one corn but a whole family of corns living together in a single field. Early plants and late ones, tall stalks and short, some bearing 2 ears and some bearing 1, kernels that ran from pale gold to deep brick red to a flinty near black, husks drawn tight against the weevil, roots that went down hunting water instead of waiting on the sky. A seed company man would have called it a mess, and by the measure of his trade it was. It did not ripen all in the same week. It did not stand at one machine height for a mechanical picker. It could not be photographed whole for a catalog plate. But it had never all failed at once, either. Not in the dust years of the 1930s, not in the wet, rotting autumns that lodged the neighbors' fields, not in the seasons the corn borer or the root rot or the leaf rust moved up the valley, because whatever the trouble was, some fraction of that varied family had always met it before and had carried the seed of its meeting forward in Amos's labeled jars. Amos could not have told you the word for what he was doing. He only knew that a field of all one thing was a field holding its breath, and that he did not intend to farm that way, and that his father had not, and that the corn had fed them all the same. Saloma had married into that corn at 19 in 1926, and for 40 years she had been its second pair of hands, shucking the seed ears in the cold of the granary, washing and drying the jars, holding the lantern while Amos read the rows aloud in the dark and wrote the reasons down. She had not thought of it as her work exactly. It was his work, and she helped the way a wife helps. And when he died in the milking parlor that spring morning, she had buried him in the plain way, in 3 days in a plain box in the district graveyard with no headstone but a small numbered marker. And she had gone on with the dairy and the garden and the 83 acres because the cows do not stop needing milking for grief. But the corn she had almost let go. There was a season, that first widowed spring of 1966, when she had stood in the cellar with the pine chest open and thought that perhaps the home corn had been Amos's and ought to be buried with Amos, that a woman alone had no business keeping up a man's particular stubbornness against the whole modern world. And then she had read the jars, the years in his hand, the reasons. 1931, the dry year, this one stood. 1945, the wet fall, this one dried clean. 1953, the borer year, this one came through. And she had understood that the corn was not Amos's stubbornness at all. It was his care, made into a thing that could outlive him, and that to let it die would be to let a little more of him die than had to. So she had carried the chest back up the cellar stairs, and in the May of 1966 she had planted the home corn, and she had planted it every May since, because keeping faith was the whole of what she had left of him. They had been married 40 years, Saloma and Amos, and in all that time she could not remember a single autumn that the seed-saving had not been a thing they did together in the evenings after the children were abed. It was, when she let herself think on it, the closest thing to courtship that two old plain people kept. The lantern lit in the cold granary, the heap of chosen ears between them, his low voice reading off the rows and the reasons, her hands sorting and her memory holding what his eyes had judged. He had taught her to read an ear the way his father had taught him, to feel the heft of it, to look at how the kernels sat in their rows clear to the tip, to turn back the husk and see whether the mold had got in at the silk end, to know a flinty ear from a soft one in the dark by the sound it made when you thumbed it. She had not understood in the early years why it mattered so much to him, why he would not simply keep the biggest and be done. It was her father-in-law, Christian, old and near blind by then, sitting by the stove the last winter of his life, who had told her, "The big ear is the corn showing off for one good year, child, but the corn that comes through every year is the corn that never betted all on the weather." She had not forgotten it. She had not, in 40 years, ever quite stopped hearing Amos's voice in the granary. And now that he was gone, the saving of the seed was the 1 hour of the year she could still hear it plain, and that, as much as any argument about yield or blight or the modern world, was why she would not give it up. She was not a sentimental woman in the ordinary sense. The plain life does not make sentimental women, asking as it does too much hard daily work of them for that. She rose in the dark to the cows, and she worked till the dark came back, and she buried what had to be buried, and she did not complain, because complaint, in her people's understanding, was a kind of ingratitude to God for the day he had given. But there is a difference between sentiment and faithfulness, and she knew it the way she knew few things. Sentiment is a feeling you keep for your own comfort, and faithfulness is a thing you do whether you feel it or not because it is owed. She did not save the corn because it made her feel close to Amos, though sometimes in the granary it did. She saved it because it was owed to him who had kept it, to Christian who had kept it before him, to the not yet born who would need it and did not know to ask, and, though she would never have put it so boldly, to the God who had made the corn able to keep itself across the generations, if only there were hands faithful enough to help it. By 1968, nearly no one in the county made corn that way anymore. They had no need to. The modern hybrid had come, and it was, by every measure a balance sheet could hold, better. It stood straighter, it yielded heavier, it ripened evener, and it picked cleaner through the new mechanical pickers that had replaced the old husking by hand. The county had converted to it field by field across the 1950s and into the 1960s, the way a tide comes in. Not all at once, but steadily. A neighbor here and a neighbor there, each conversion making the next one easier and the holdout stranger, until the home corns of the old farms survived only in the few plain districts where a widow too set in her ways, or too poor, or too stubborn, still saved her own seed because she always had. And the converting was not only a change of seed, it was a change of what it meant to be a farmer. The man who saved his own corn was the author of his own crop. He carried the whole inheritance in a chest in his cellar, and he answered to no one for it. And what he planted in May was the distilled judgment of every Stoltzfus who had ever walked that field before him. The man who bought the hybrid was a customer. He answered to the catalog and the co-op and the dealer's delivery schedule. His seed came from a breeding station he would never see, made by a method he was not told, and could not have copied if he had been. And each spring he began again from zero, with nothing of last year's field in his own two hands, because the hybrid's children do not breed true, and the whole arrangement depended, by its very design, on his coming back to buy again. It was, the agricultural economists agreed, a marvelous and modernizing thing, and it lifted the yields of the nation in a single generation higher than they had climbed in all the generations before, and fed more people from less ground than any farmer of Christian Stoltzfus's day could have dreamed. But something went quiet in the cellars of the county in those years that no balance sheet had a column for: the slow disappearance of 10,000 local corns, each one a century's worth of one family's particular answers to one particular piece of ground, traded away, field by field and farm by farm, for a uniform excellence delivered in a printed sack. Most of those old corns were lost in the conversion and are lost still, gone as completely as a language with no last speaker. A handful survived, here and there, only in the few cellars where someone too poor or too faithful or too stubborn to change kept on filling the jars. At Cherry Hill the jars kept filling. Saloma did not think of herself as the guardian of anything. She thought of herself as a wife keeping her husband's habit. But the two things, in the end, turned out to be exactly the same thing. The men of the county were kind about it, which is its own particular kind of unkindness. The agricultural extension agent for that part of Lancaster County was a decent young man named Howard Krebs, 2 years out of the state college at University Park, with a degree in agronomy and a glove box full of hybrid brochures and a sincere and uncomplicated faith that the future he had studied was a gift he was carrying to people who simply had not yet had the chance to receive it. He stopped at the Cherry Hill Lane more than once, across 1968 and 1969, to explain to the widow Stoltzfus, slowly and warmly, what she was leaving on the table. He showed her the yield trials. He showed her the replicated comparison plots from the county demonstration farm, the hybrid out-yielding the old open-pollinated corns by 30 and 40 bushels to the acre. Year on year, the numbers as plain and as honest as numbers can be. He told her, with real concern in his young face, that the seed she was saving by hand in glass jars would yield her a third less than the hybrid the co-op could deliver to her granary in a printed sack for a few dollars, and that a woman alone running a dairy at her age could not afford a sentiment that cost her a third of her corn every single year. He was not wrong about the numbers. That is the thing that must be understood, if the rest of it is to mean anything. In every ordinary year of that decade, the balance sheet was on Howard Krebs's side, and he had the trials to prove it, and he believed with his whole heart that he was being a good and useful man, and by the only measure that anyone in the county was using, he was. The neighbors who farmed the English ground along the Newport Pike were warmer still, and meant it worse. They leaned on her fence rail of an evening in their ball caps and told one another, loud enough to carry across to where the old woman worked her garden in the last light, that the widow at Cherry Hill was farming with her dead husband's ghost, that you could not run a place on memory, that the plain people would plant with horses and save their corn in mason jars until the Lord himself sent a tractor and a printed sack down the lane to them. There was a man named Dewey Hartzler in particular who farmed 200 acres of the new high hybrid along the pike and was prosperous in just the way the new way made men prosperous, and who could not seem to let the matter rest, who took the widow's quiet refusal to modernize as a kind of standing rebuke to his own choices, and answered that discomfort as men will by making her into the joke he reached for whenever the talk at the feed store turned to how far farming had come. It was Dewey who started calling the home corn her mason jar corn as a thing to laugh at, and the name stuck and traveled to the feed store and the produce auction and the sale barn. The mason jar widow, the old woman out at Cherry Hill who would not be told. It would be wrong, though, to think she stood entirely alone. Within her own district she was not strange at all. She was simply Saloma, the widow Stoltzfus, who kept a good, clean farm and a fine table, and her late husband's corn, and there were other older families in District 6 and in the districts around it who still saved their own seed of one crop or another, an old tobacco strain here, a particular pole bean there, a winter squash that one family had kept since nobody could remember, so that what looked like lonely stubbornness from the English side of the fence looked, from inside the plain community, like nothing more than ordinary faithfulness, the normal background hum of a people who kept things. When the question of the hybrid had first come up in the district, and it had come up, for the plain people are not fools and do not refuse a useful thing out of mere habit, it had been talked over slowly at the kitchen tables, and after the worship services, weighed the way the district weighed every new thing. Not is it profitable, but what will it do to us? And the men had seen quickly enough what it would do. It would make them dependent on the company and the co-op for the one thing a farmer had always provided himself. It would put a yearly cash cost where there had been none. It would, A little make each farm less able to stand on its own and more tied to the market and the dealer and the wider world the plain people kept at a careful arm's length. Some in the district had taken up the hybrid anyway for the yield and were not shunned for it, the matter not being one the ordinance forbade outright. But many had not, and Saloma's keeping of the home corn was, in that light, not one widow's eccentricity, but a thread in a much older and wider cloth. The plain people's long, patient, communal wariness of any new thing that made a man need the world more, and his neighbors and his own 2 hands less. The English along the pike could not see the cloth. They saw only the one old woman, and they made of her a joke, because a joke is what men make of a thing they have decided not to understand. Saloma Stoltzfus did not argue with any of them. It was not the plain way to argue, and it was not her way besides. She listened to Howard Krebs, and she thanked him for his trouble, and she sent him home with a jar of her chow-chow for his young wife, and she did not plant his hybrid. She let Dewey Hartzler's word travel, and did not chase after it. The ordning of her district did not forbid a great many of the modern things, outright so much as it asked of each new thing a hard and patient question. What will this do to us, to our families, to our church, to the way we are bound to one another, and to the ground we were given? And it counseled waiting and watching closely what a new thing did to the people who took it up first before a plain community took it up itself. That patience had nothing of cowardice in it, and nothing of mere nostalgia. It was a discipline, the considered and communal refusal to be the first to find out the hard way. And so Saloma waited and watched as her people had taught her for 300 years, and she walked her field in the autumn the way Amos had walked it, and she chose her 100 mothers, and she saved her seed. She could not have given the extension agent a phrase like genetic diversity, because she did not have it. The science that would one day put a name to what she was doing had not yet troubled itself to walk out into a plain woman's cornfield and look. What she had instead was a thing her husband had told her so many times across 40 years that it had worn a smooth groove in her mind, never to put the whole of the farm into one kind of anything, because the one kind you trust completely is the one kind that can take everything you have in a single bad season. He had said it about the cattle, and about the hay ground, and about owing the bank, and about which fields to put to corn, and which to keep in pasture. He had said it most of all about corn. She did not know why it was true. She only knew that he had believed it the way he believed the Psalms, and that the believing of it had kept Stoltzfus ground fed through droughts and wet years, and the corn diseases that came and went up the valley for 100 years and more. So she did in the autumn what he had done. After the first hard frost had cured the standing corn, but before the pickers came through, she walked the rows alone in the cool of the morning, with a gathering apron tied at her waist. And she read the field the way another woman might read a long and familiar letter. She did not take the largest ears, because the largest ears were often the greediest and the weakest. She took from the plants that had stood through the August thunderstorm when their neighbors lay flat in the mud. She took from the stalks still green at the base when the rest had gone brown and brittle. She took the ears that hung down and dried clean, their husks turned over at the tip like a hand cupped against the rain, because an ear that sheds the rain sheds the mold with it. She took from the wet corner by the spring and from the dry knoll by the road, both, on purpose, so that the corn would keep its whole range and not narrow itself to one kind of year, from 100 different plants in 100 different corners of the field she chose. A few ears from each, and never more, never all from one place, never all of one shape or color, and she carried them in the apron to the granary and braided back their husks and hung them from the rafters in long, heavy plates to finish their drying, where the air could move freely around them and the mice could not climb to reach them. And only when they were hard and rattling, in the deep cold of December and January, did she sit by the kitchen stove of an evening and shell them by hand into the waiting jars, rubbing two ears, one against the other the old way until the kernels fell, and write out on the paper tags the year and the row and the reason in the German. That was the only writing she had ever been taught. It took her the better part of 2 weeks every year, fitted in between the morning and the evening milking. Howard Krebs could have sold her enough seed for the whole 83 acres in a printed sack in 5 minutes and told her so, kindly more than once. She thanked him each time and went on with her shelling. And the saving of the seed was only the still point of a turning year. In the May, when the soil had warmed and the oak leaves were the size of a squirrel's ear the way the old sign had it, she planted behind the team of Belgians with the check row planter that dropped the seed in the cross-marked grid that let her cultivate the corn in both directions, and so keep down the weeds without a drop of the chemical the county had taken to spraying. Through the June and the early July she cultivated, walking behind the one-horse shovel plow up the rows and back, the sweat running in the horse's flanks, steaming in the wet morning heat, the young corn rising green and uneven on either side of her, uneven because it was various. Some plants already knee-high, and some just breaking the crust, which would have driven a hybrid man to distraction, and did not trouble her at all, because she knew that the unevenness was the whole point, was the 100 mothers each keeping her own counsel about when the season had truly come. She laid the corn by in the heat of midsummer, when it grew too tall to cultivate, and then there was the long green waiting of August, the corn making its ears in the dark inside the husks, the tassels gold and shedding in the morning, and the silk catching the pollen the way it had caught it for 10,000 years before any laboratory thought to interfere. And then the curing frosts of the late September, and the picking by hand into the wagon, ear by ear, the good ears to the crib and the seed ears, chosen as she went, to the granary rafters. And then the winter, and the shelling and the jars, and the May again. It was the same year her husband's people had farmed for 200 years, and the old country's people for 1,000 before that, the year that turns and turns, and asks of those who keep it only that they keep it, faithfully and in its order, and she kept it, alone now at 61, the way she had kept it at 40 with Amos beside her, because the year does not care that a woman is widowed, and the cows do not, and the corn does not, and there was a mercy in that. She had found that the turning work went on, and carried her along in its turning through the grief and past it, the way a current carries a swimmer who has stopped being able to swim. What none of them knew, not the warm young extension agent, not the men leaning on the fence, not the prosperous and needling Dewey Hartzler, not the county that had so sensibly converted, and least of all the widow herself, was that the modern hybrid carried, hidden deep inside it where no farmer could see and no catalog mentioned, the one exact flaw that Amos Stoltzfus had spent his whole life refusing. To make hybrid seed cheaply, the breeders had needed a way to keep the seed parent corn from pollinating itself, so that it would take only the pollen of the chosen father line and no other. For a long time they had done it by brute labor, sending crews of teenagers walking the seed fields in the July heat to pull the tassels off the mother rose one plant at a time, a vast and costly and sweltering work. And then, in the 1950s, they had found a far better way, in a small quirk of the corn's own inner machinery, a trait called Texas male-sterile cytoplasm, inherited only down the mother line, that kept a plant's tassels from shedding any pollen of their own, and so saved the whole sweating army of detasselers from the field entirely. It was elegant, it was cheap, it worked beautifully, and it swept the seed industry so completely and so quickly that by the end of the 1960s, the overwhelming majority of all the hybrid corn planted in the United States, hundreds of different hybrid names, sold under dozens of different company labels across some 40 million acres and more, carried that one same Texas cytoplasm down in its veins, different names on the printed sacks, the same single mother underneath them all. The Corn Belt of America had become, without anyone intending it and without anyone quite noticing, one enormous field, a continent of one mother, and a thing that is all one mother can be taken, all of it by one single trouble. The trouble, when it came, was a fungus. Bipolaris matus. The plant pathologists would write it down in their journals. Southern Corn Leaf Blight. The farmers would call it across their fences. A leaf disease that had always been a minor and manageable nuisance in American corn until, in the warm and humid seasons at the very turn of the decade, a new and far more vicious strain of it that the scientists would name Race T discovered that the Texas male-sterile cytoplasm was not merely something it could tolerate, but something it could feast upon. The very trait that had made the hybrids so cheap and so clever to breed was the precise trait the new fungus had learned to key upon and to ravage. The old open-pollinated corns, with their 100 different mothers and their ordinary mixed cytoplasm, shrugged the new blight off, much as they had always shrugged off the old one. The new uniform hybrids could not shrug it off at all. In the autumn of 1969, the sharpest-eyed pathologists in the histologists watched the new race move through the winter seed production fields of Florida and the Gulf, and they were afraid, and they wrote their careful warnings, and the warnings were, for the most part, not heeded in time, because the seed for the whole of the 1970 crop had already been grown the summer before, already cleaned and graded and bagged, already sitting in the warehouses and the dealers' sheds and the printed sacks, carrying the hidden flaw northward and westward into the very ground that the whole country was, that spring, about to plant. By the spring of 1970, the trouble was already in the seed, carried north in the very sacks the farmers trusted most, planted by their own hands into the long, straight, uniform rows, a quiet inheritance of ruin sown clear across a continent that did not know it was holding its breath. There is no malice in a fungus, and there was none in the men who had bred the hybrids. They had solved a real and pressing problem in a genuinely clever way, and for 15 good and prosperous years the cleverness had paid. That is the hardest part of the lesson of that autumn. And Saloma Stoltzfus, who never once gloated over any of it, would have been the first to say so. The hybrid was not a sin. The men who planted it were not fools. Howard Krebs was not a fool, and meant nothing but good. They had simply done together, all at once across a whole vast nation, the one single thing that Amos had spent his quiet life refusing to do on even 83 acres. They had put the entire crop into one kind, and called the sameness of it progress, and never thought to ask what the sameness might cost them in the one bad season when the one trouble finally came that the one kind could not meet. Saloma planted her home corn in the May of 1970 the way she had planted it every May of her widowhood, with a horse-drawn check row planter, and her grandson Eli, 14 years old that spring, walking the team of broad Belgians up the rows and back while she rode the planter seat and watched the wire and the seed plates into the same black ground that had grown her family's varied, unfamous, hundred-mothered corn for over 100 years, up and down the Newport Pike and across the whole green breadth of Lancaster County, and out across the enormous Midwest behind it. Her neighbors and her neighbors' neighbors planted their printed sacks of hybrid into the long uniform rows, as they had for 15 settled years, and thought no more about the seed in their hands than a man thinks about the air that he is breathing. Dewey Hartzler put in 200 acres of a popular and well-regarded hybrid and reckoned, by the trials and by his own 15 good years, that he would bring in the best crop of his life. The blight came north with the summer. It came in the warm nights and the wet, heavy mornings of June and July, the weather of that particular year being exactly the warm and humid weather that the new fungus loved best, and it came fast, and it came straight for the cytoplasm. A farmer would walk his field in the last week of July and see, low down on the older leaves, the first long tan lesions with their dark wet borders, only a few of them, here and there, nothing yet to lose any sleep over, and then walk that same field again 10 days later and find the lesions run together into whole dead leaves, and the dead leaves run together into whole dead plants, and the dead plants standing there in their straight machine-made rows, the dead tobacco, brown color of late October in the middle of green August. By the gray hours of the August mornings, the hybrid fields of the county were going brown, the way a thing goes brown when it is burned from the inside out, the ears small and chaffy and light in the husk, or rotting black at the shank where the fungus had taken hold, or never properly set at all, and the stalks, with no living leaf left anywhere on them to feed the plant, lost their strength and lodged and fell, so that field after field along the pike lay flat and brown, and ruined as though a great storm had walked straight across them in the night, though no storm had come. Across the whole of the United States that one autumn the blight would take something near to 15% of the entire national corn crop, 1 billion bushels of corn and more. the worst single plant disease epidemic in all the country's history, and in the hardest hit counties of the South, it took half the crop and more than half. And in the warm, wet bottoms of Lancaster County, the hybrid fields along the Newport Pike were a ruin that a man could stand at the edge of and weep. Dewey Hartzler walked his own 200 lodged and blackened acres in the last week of August, and he did not lean on anybody's fence that week to make a joke about anything at all. And what was happening along the Newport Pike was happening that same brown summer very nearly everywhere. The blight did not stay in Lancaster County. It could not, for the one mother it fed upon had been planted from the Carolinas to Minnesota, from the Atlantic seaboard out to the edge of the dry plains where the corn finally gave way to the wheat. It moved north on the warm, wet winds as the season moved north into Maryland and across the Ohio country and out into the deep heart of the corn belt, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, the great flat states where the corn ran to the horizon in every direction, and every acre of it, very nearly, wore the same vulnerable face. The radio farm reports that summer which the English neighbors listened to and the plain people heard about second-hand went from curiosity to unease to something close to dread across a matter of weeks. The United States Department of Agriculture, which had been warned and had, like everyone, been caught with the seed already in the ground, began to talk in numbers that had no precedent. 10% of the crop, then 12, then a figure near 15% of all the corn in America, 1 billion bushels, and more simply gone, burned from the inside by a fungus that 3 years before had been a footnote. The price of corn climbed as the bushels vanished. The livestock men who bought corn to feed began to sweat the winter ahead. The newspapers in the cities, which never wrote about corn, and underneath all of it, mostly unspoken, because mostly not yet understood by the public, lay the single brittle fact that the scientists had grasped with horror by midsummer, that the catastrophe had not happened because the corn was weak, but because the corn was all the same, that a nation had, for the sake of a real and genuine efficiency, quietly bred itself into a single enormous target, and a small and patient fungus had simply walked up and hit it. It was the largest object lesson in the danger of uniformity that American agriculture had ever been handed, written across 40 million acres in the dead brown of a single August, and it had been bought at a price no balance sheet had thought to reckon, because the risk it measured was the kind that costs nothing at all every ordinary year, and then everything at once. And in the very middle of all that brown ruin, out at Cherry Hill, there stood 83 acres of corn that the blight had hardly touched. It was not that her home corn was somehow immune. Nothing is ever truly immune, and the blight was in her field too. Here and there, a lesion on this leaf, a sick plant struggling in that low, wet row. It was that her corn was various. Among Amos's 100 mothers there were plants the fungus could badly hurt, and plants it could barely manage to mark, plants that carried the vulnerable cytoplasm, and many more that carried none of it. Early plants that had hardened off before the very worst of the wet July weather, and late plants that had stood green and feeding straight through it, and the disease that could run through a field of identical hybrids like a grass fire through a dry August pasture could only smolder and stall and gutter out in a field where every fourth plant was a wall it had never learned to climb, and the next plant beyond it was a wall of some altogether different kind. The blight that needed one mother to feast upon arrived at Cherry Hill and found 100 of them standing shoulder to shoulder and could make a proper meal of none. Her corn stood green and tall into September. Her ears filled and dried and turned their tips down clean, exactly the way Amos had patiently selected them to do across 100 quiet autumns. The neighbors saw it before the scientists ever did. A man hauling his own ruined brown nubbins past the Cherry Hill lane in the worst of that August could not keep himself from turning his head at the green standing tall and sound beyond her fence. And the turning of that one head was the beginning of the end of all the laughing. It is one thing to call a widow backward when her old corn yields a third less than yours, and the balance sheet at the bank agrees with you every single autumn for 15 years running. It is another thing entirely to drive your own dead crop slowly past her living one in the worst harvest of your whole farming life. They did not come to her fence to mock that autumn. A few of them came, instead, with their hats held in their hands, to ask, quietly and a little ashamed, whether she might perhaps have a little seed to spare them for the spring. And she did have it, and she gave it, and she did not say one single word to any of them about the years of the leaning and the laughing, because that, too, was not the plain way. Even Dewey Hartzler came, near the very end of it, and stood a long while down at the foot of the lane before he could make his legs carry him up it, and asked her, not quite able to meet her eyes, whether the mason-jar corn might have a few jars to spare for a neighbor who had been a proud fool. And she filled a clean grain sack for him from the granary, and would take not 1 cent for it. And she told him only this, to save back his own seed from it in the fall, and to choose that seed from the plants that had stood, and to never again, as long as he farmed, put his whole place into one single kind of anything. It was the nearest thing to a sermon that she preached in the whole long affair, and she preached it to the one man who had most needed to hear it, and she preached it gently, and then she let him go on home to think about it. Her granary at the end of that one terrible year was the fullest in the whole district, and very nearly the only granary in the entire county with seed standing in it that would come true again the following spring, because hybrid seed cannot be saved, its children will not breed true. And the great seed companies, whose own breeding fields had been blighted that summer right along with everybody else's, would spend the whole of that coming winter in something very close to a panic, scouring the southern hemisphere and the warm far corners of the world for any clean corn seed of any kind at all that they might multiply up in time for a badly frightened spring market. There was that one strange winter all across the whole flattened corn belt, a sudden and entirely unaccustomed hunger for exactly the thing the country had spent 15 confident years throwing carelessly away. Open-pollinated corn, varied corn, corn that a farmer could save and replant from his own hand, corn that did not all carry the one mother, and so could not all carry the one fatal flaw. The seed dealers along the pike, who 8 months before had been selling the hybrid by the ton with the easy confidence of men selling the future, spent that winter making telephone calls in a rising register of worry. The companies behind them, the great breeding houses of the Midwest, had lost their own multiplication fields to the same blight that took the farmers, and now faced a spring in which the demand for clean seed would be desperate and the supply of it frighteningly thin. They sent men south of the equator to the winter summer of Argentina and Chile to grow emergency crops of whatever clean cytoplasm seed they could lay hands on, racing the calendar to have something, anything, in the sacks by planting time. It was, for that one winter, a seller's market in the one commodity the country had spent a generation deciding it no longer needed to value, the ability to make your own seed. Old men who had kept their open-pollinated corn out of pure stubbornness found neighbors at the door. A few enterprising souls who had a crib of savable corn discovered they could name a price, and quietly, in the agricultural colleges and the few seed banks that then existed, men who studied such things began to say aloud to one another what the blight had shouted at all of them, that the old, varied corns the country had been so methodically discarding were not junk to be cleared away to make room for the improved future, but a kind of insurance, a reservoir of difference, the only place the breeders could go to find the genes to fix what uniformity had broken. The lesson did not last forever. Lessons of that kind rarely do, and the pull of uniformity is strong because uniformity is in every ordinary year more profitable. But for a season the country understood, with the particular clarity that only catastrophe provides, exactly what Amos Stoltzfus had understood all along on 83 acres, and exactly what his widow was keeping for it in a pine chest in a cellar at Cherry Hill while it figured the thing out. Howard Krebs came back up the Cherry Hill lane again in the late autumn of 1970. He did not have his brochures with him this time. He had, instead, a soil scientist and a plant pathologist from the college riding in the truck beside him. Two older men who had spent the whole of that ruinous summer watching the very thing they best understood destroy the very thing they had so confidently recommended, and who had heard, the way such news always travels in a farming county, that there was a plain widow out past the creek at Cherry Hill, whose old mason jar corn had somehow stood green clear through the worst of it. They asked Saloma Stoltzfus, through the young agent who knew her a little, whether they might walk her field, and she let them. They went up and down the rows with her in the cool afternoon, and the pathologist crouched down and turned the clean down hanging ears over in his hands with something very close to reverence, and found the few blighted plants scattered among the many sound ones, and understood there in the field, down on his knees in her corn, exactly what her 100 different mothers had done that summer that his one single mother could not. They asked whether they might take a few ears away to study, and she gave them a basket of them. And then they asked her more carefully, the young agent doing the asking because he was the one who knew her, whether she would consider sharing some of her seed, not selling it. They understood she might not wish to sell it, only sharing it, because a corn that carried 100 mothers, a corn the blight had not been able to master, was in that one ruined autumn worth more to the whole future of American farming than any trademark in any glossy catalog, and there was very nearly none of its kind left anywhere that anyone could readily lay a hand on. She gave them what she could spare. She would not take any of their money. It was not the plain way to make a profit off a neighbor's hard year, and she counted the whole hungry country a neighbor that autumn, and she would not let them put her name down anywhere in their report. And when the younger of the two scientists called her field a national treasure, she corrected him gently and said that it was only corn, and that her husband had saved it, and that she had only kept the faith with him. She filled their baskets from the pine chest down in the cellar, jar by labeled jar, the years written in Amos's hand and now in her own, and she read the tags aloud to them as she went, the way Amos always used to read them aloud to her. 1952, this one stood in the wind. 1958, this one stayed green in the drought. 1961, this one dried clean in the wet fall, so that the scientists would carry away with them not only the seed itself, but a little of the reasons that went with it. Then she fed all three of them at her kitchen table, because they had come a long way, and it was well past their dinner time. A plain and quiet meal of ham and schnitz, and her own bread and her own butter. And she sent them back down the lane in the early autumn dark with the heavy baskets on the seat between them. And she went out alone afterward to stand in the granary that was full when all the counties were empty, in the dark, in the deep familiar smell of her husband's corn. And she was not in that one long moment entirely a widow. What became of the seed she gave away that autumn was not a single dramatic thing, but a great many small quiet ones, which is how such things actually go in the world, whatever the stories pretend. The ears she gave the two scientists went back to the college and were grown out the next summer in careful isolated plots, and studied, and the studying of them helped, in its modest way, the larger work that was going on all across the country that year, the work of understanding what diverse cytoplasm did and what uniform cytoplasm failed to do, the work that would lead the seed companies to break their dependence on the one Texas mother, and that would give a quiet new urgency to the keeping of old varied seed in the years that followed. A handful of her ears, the younger scientists saw to it, went into a germplasm collection, cataloged under a number rather than a name, because she had asked that her name be left out of it, where some of that Stoltzfus corn that Amos and Christian's father had bent toward the Cherry Hill ground across 100 years sits, to this day, in cold storage, available to any breeder in the world who someday needs the particular thing it knows how to do. And the seed she gave her neighbors that fall, to the Hartzlers and the Brubakers and the Ashes and the half-dozen other families who came up the lane that hard autumn with their hats in their hands, went into their cribs and their own first awkward attempts at saving, so that for a few years, at least, there was more open-pollinated corn growing along the Newport Pike than there had been in 2 decades, planted by men who had learned in a single brown August the thing the widow had been quietly trying to tell them all along. Most of them drifted back to the hybrid within a few seasons, once the companies had clean seed again and the memory of the blight had begun to soften, because the pull of the easy yield is strong and men forget. That is no more than the truth, and Saloma would not have been surprised by it. but a few kept on saving. A few always do, and the corn went on moving, hand to hand, the way a living corn must, carried forward out of that one terrible year by the few hands faithful enough to carry it. She farmed 11 more autumns after that one. She never once planted the hybrid. The yield trials had never been wrong about her corn. In an ordinary year, it still gave her a third less than the hybrid down the pike, and she still made her quiet living on the dairy and the garden and the careful, unwasting economy of a woman who had learned to need very little. But she had come to hold in her own hands what the trials could never measure, and by the brown autumn of 1970, the whole county had come to hold it alongside her. That a third less in every ordinary year was simply the premium that a wise farm paid against the one extraordinary year that could otherwise take everything it had at a single stroke, and that such a premium, paid faithfully and without complaint across the whole length of a lifetime, was the cheapest crop insurance in all of agriculture. The men along the Newport Pike did not lean on her fence in quite the same way ever again. Dewey Hartzler saved back his own seed that fall, and the next fall, and the fall after that, choosing it from the plants that had stood. And he never said the words mason jar corn again as a joke, except for one last time years later when he overheard a young man at the sale barn laughing at an old Amishman who was saving his seed by hand, and Dewey told the young man, shortly and without explaining himself, to go on out to Cherry Hill some day and ask the widow there what that particular joke had cost the county in the autumn of 1970, and the young man did not understand him. And Dewey did not bother to explain. The great seed companies, for their part, learned the hard lesson the blight had taught them and broke the country's whole dependence on the single Texas cytoplasm, blending their breeding lines again and guarding their diversity so that no one fungus could ever again find the entire national crop wearing the same single face. And the Extension Service, which is a humble institution at its best, carried the lesson forward in its own careful way. And the seed banks and the germplasm repositories that exist in the world today to guard the old varied corns and 1,000 other old varied things against the next uniform season, whenever it should come, exist in some part because of ruinous years like 1970 and because of patient keepers like her, none of which Saloma Stoltzfus ever did herself, or sought, or would for one moment have claimed. She only kept her husband's old habit on 83 acres in one plain district, with a pine chest and 100 glass jars, and a discipline of patience that her people had taught her across 300 years was finally a form of faith. The years after the blight were quieter years and good ones in the main. The dairy paid, the garden fed her, and a good deal of the district besides. Her grandson Eli grew up and married and took ground of his own 2 roads over, and learned the corn from her the way she had learned it from Amos. In the granary, in the lantern light, the low reading of the rows, she grew, without ever meaning to or noticing it, into one of those old women a plain community quietly orders itself around, the one the young wives came to with a sick calf or a failed batch of soap or a marriage gone hard, the one whose judgment the men asked after at the kitchen table, though she never sat at it when the church matters were decided. The keeper, not only of a corn now, but of a great many of the small, hard-won knowings that a people accumulate and can so easily lose in a single careless generation. She would have said she did nothing of the kind. She would have said she milked her cows and kept her garden and saved her seed and went to worship, and that was all, and that it was enough, and more than she deserved. The Newport Pike got its first traffic light in those years, and then its first housing. The English world pressing a little closer every season the way it always did. And the Plain District drew its careful line and held it, and went on. Plain, in the midst of it, the buggies and the bank barns and the unelectrified houses and the hand-saved seed, an island of a older and slower kind, of time, kept on purpose, kept as a witness, kept the way Saloma kept the corn, not out of fear of the new, but out of a clear-eyed and chosen love of something the new was in such a hurry to throw away. When she died in the deep winter of 1981, the pine chest passed down to her daughter Mary, and then in its own time to her granddaughter, who keeps it yet on a farm not far at all from Cherry Hill. The oldest jars in it gone cloudy now with the years, but the newest ones still clear, and every one of them labeled in a careful hand with the year and the row and the reason, 100 mothers, still, so that no single trouble can ever take them all. That is the whole of it, and Saloma Stoltzfus would have wanted it told plainly. The county did not change its mind about its corn because a widow stood up and lectured it. She never once lectured anyone, save the single time, gently, to the one man who had come up her lane ashamed. It changed because a small and patient and deeply unfashionable faithfulness turned out, in one terrible season, to be the only thing left standing green in a flattened brown field. The hybrid was bigger, and it was better, and it was the future, and on the balance sheet it was right. And for 15 good years, the balance sheet was the only thing that anyone thought to consult. But the balance sheet did not know what Amos Stoltzfus had known and could never quite say, what his widow kept for him without ever being able to defend it in words, what the whole corn belt of America learned in the brown August of 1970 and has tried ever since, with its seed banks and its diversity and its hard-won new humility, not to forget that the one kind you trust completely is the one kind that can take everything from you into single season, and that the old, plain, various, 100-mothered way was never backwardness at all. It was only patience. It was only a man who loved his wife and his ground enough to leave them both a corn that could not all die at once. And it was a woman who kept faith with him, quietly on 83 acres, for long enough that the whole world had time to find out that he had been right.